ready to start a watercolor painting, and this is the reference material that I want to work off of. So the first step is going to be to crop it and see the best design for this piece. This seems a little bit dark and busy over there. It's drawing my eye over to the left, and then I get stuck. So if I crop some of that off, then that's an improvement. Alright, then once you've decided on your final arrangement, tape your paper down. Now as I move on to the rough sketch, I'm going to begin with some guidelines. I want to know where my vertical center and my horizontal center are. I have to have a similarly proportioned piece of paper for the sketch. Okay, so now I can with greater accuracy transfer this drawing onto this rough sketch. So now the trick is to see where on this page does the horizon line fall, and you can see it's going to be almost exactly the 1/4 down mark. So I can just eyeball that in on my paper, zip, and then do some similar eyeballing for these other shapes. Once I have the guidelines, it's easier to see the negative shapes that fall at certain points. So here the blue sky ends about 1/4 of the way after this center point and then goes all the way to the edge. So I can just sketch that in, and I can sketch this river in similarly, seeing that this crack in the ice here falls about 1/4 of the way down the page after this halfway mark. That would be about here. And it extends not quite to the center of the paper, but falls about 1/4 of the way after the center, which would be about here. So I can sketch in those larger shapes quickly and with really high accuracy, just using 4 simple marks. If I didn't have these marks, even on this simple piece, I could easily become lost. The trick is to be patient enough that you don't just start to disregard the marks and put things down wherever you feel like it. Once you are satisfied, then you can transfer those same lines to your watercolor paper. After scribbling over the back of the drawing, I'm going to flip it, move it carefully onto my watercolor paper, and then use a 2H pencil and just transfer these lines. So let me do this boring part off camera and then come back to you. Now I've drawn the sketch on my paper. The lines are nice and clear. You always work back to front with watercolor. So the farthest thing in the distance is the sky. We want to lay that down as one solid shape first, and then add things on top of it as we move forward in the picture plane. I'm going to use a flat brush to lay down my shapes as much as possible, because that ensures a smoother finish. Now I'm also going to show you another trick for color matching. If you really want your finished piece to look like the reference material, then get a square of watercolor paper and test your colors right next to the color that you're trying to match before you put it down on your paper. That's good right there. So then I'll just drop that right over the sky. I want to pull it across so that those tree branches can be on top of it, and that's all there is to it. Now that sky is dry, so I'm going to put in that slightly darker background mountain shape. And I want to test again to make sure I get it right. And remember, watercolor does dry lighter than you put it down. So I'll just sneak this down. A beautiful mountain shape. Once you have the drawing in place and you're confident in your line work, filling in the color using this method is a slow, careful process that's almost like a paint by number. Let that dry a couple minutes, come back again. That's dry again, so I'm going to move forward and put in these brown mountains. Color match. It's the same process again. Just do a color match and lay it down. And I did protect some of these snow cap shapes, so I'm just painting over that dry biscuit. And as I come to the edge of the mountain here, I don't want it to just stop, so I'm going to get my brush just a little bit damp and soften out that edge. And then that is the same color that I see down in this scrub. So as long as I've got it on my brush and that's separated from the other stuff so that the colors won't bleed and touch, I can lay that in. And I'll blend in a little bit more of this reddish brown. I'm using a dry brush on this edge, and I'm stippling in some of this weedy area here. To keep the texture broken, I'm using a variety of different strokes, and because the brush is dry, those lines are going to remain crisp on the page. And as I move into this brushy stuff, I'm going to do another test to see if I'm getting that color right. Take your time and you get that color matched right the first time. You're going to save time in the long run because you won't have to make adjustments. You won't have to go down with a second layer, and your picture will look just like your photo. So now I'm going to lay in some of that brush and move to this redder stuff that's in the background. And I'm working into that red with a yellow ochre while the color is still wet. So I'll get just some nice blending of tones. I'm going to use a wetter wash and throw in this brushy area behind the tree branches. Don't want it to look too deliberate. Now that this wash is dry, I'm going to add some of these tree details. And I like to do trees with a rigger. The pencil lines help, so I don't have any guesswork. And you see how carefully I add these details. Now that those dark shapes are in place, I might need to let them dry and then go over into the brush again with a secondary color to give some more base to these weeds. But first things first, those tree branches need to be completely put in. And this is just the same process for these branches on the left. Now there are some really dark rocks here in the foreground, or middle ground at least. The next thing I'm going to do is start to lay down this water. So I'm going to switch back to my flat, get it a little bit wet, and then try to match the different colors of blue on the water. I'm going to start towards the back. I'll go with that. And then just carefully fill in this blue tone here. Using a flat will help the process to go fairly quickly. I'm going to have some trouble keeping these washes nice and fluid, so I'm going to go ahead and wash in some water. And this is a water masking technique, so I'm being really careful where I put that water. I'm going to adhere to those pencil lines for the bank really closely because I already took the time to put them in carefully. Down here it's going to be darker, but for right now I just want to get that wash in there, so I'm painting it wet and fast. Now for down here, I'm going to go much stronger, darker, and then let it gradually fade out. So see how dark it is down here as the river is coming closer to the viewer. So I'm just going to mimic what I see as best I can, and I'll come back to you when the water is complete. Alright, I've put in the water and it's dry, but let me show you how I would go about putting in those shadows now. Here's the reference material. Don't forget to do a test. Good. When you have your color right, then make sure that you have enough marks on the paper to indicate where these shadows go, because it's pretty precise. And then I'm just going to use a flat brush and stroke those in. And you're just painting what you see. Now for some of these other shadows, they get a little bit more gray as they retreat to the background. So I'll gray them down a bit. Now here my shadow got a little bit dark, so I can just blot it up a little bit. Then in here I'm moving into the background more, so I'm going to blot some of those shadows because the contrast decreases. So this is just a slow process, being careful where you place your shadows and then putting them in where you see them. Very straightforward. So let me do a little bit more work on the shadows off camera and then we'll come back again. Now the preliminary shadow shapes are all in place. There's a little bit of detail work to be done and some blending, and I want to put in these ice flows. So I'm going to carefully match that tone. That's good. So once I have my color found, it's a simple matter of painting that ice flow shape in. So I put that down as one big shape, try to keep my edges interesting. Then some of this color I'm going to bring up into the shadows to break them up a little bit so they don't look so lined. And I'll blot in spots as well to bring out just a bit of interesting mottled texture. So all I need to do to finish up this piece is to work a little bit more in this foliage area. And I'm just going to use my rigger to lay down a few fine lines for that lighter foliage. See, I'm just quickly brushing in a few individual strokes that will make this look more like grasses in the foreground instead of an unidentified blob. But do try to match up your individual strokes with things that you see in the picture. So in this style of painting, we're adhering a lot more closely to what the reference material tells us, and so I'm going slowly and making my strokes more deliberate. This is all there is to the process, so I'm going to finish this up off camera and come back to it one last time so you can see the final piece. Okay, here's our final piece. Now the last step before you can actually say it's done, just means to take off that tape, and when you do that you'll see an instant matte with a nice clean white edge all around it, so you can get a better sense of how it's going to look when it's framed, and immediately it's a lot cleaner. Go back to the reference material. Now here's the finished painting. So you can see that just by taking your time and painting little bit by little bit, very piecemeal, you can still make a really good painting. It's a little bit less scary for somebody who's just starting out. It's a lot slower, it's a lot more controlled. So if this style appeals to you, now you have the working foundation for going back to your own studio and giving it a whirl. So that concludes our tutorials for September. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you join me again next time for more drawing and painting.